So the players in my homebrew D&D campaign have just completed a long journey to a magical floating island in the sky. There's just one problem. I don't have one. So let's build it. We're starting this craft, as we so often do, with some 1-inch XPS foam and my Proxxon hot wire tool. That said, you can definitely use thicker sheets of foam if you'd like. That just isn't available where I live, so I'm cursed to live out my days toiling away with multiple sheets of foam and lots of hot glue. But first I'll measure out the dimensions of the top layer of this foam island and mark out the general shape with a permanent marker, since I have something in particular that'll be going on top of it. Now it's time to cut this out. And you can use a knife for this task as well, but if you're using a hot wire tool like I am, just make sure you take the proper safety precautions like wearing a mask and working in a well-ventilated area. I like to pretend that I'm Darth Vader when I wear mine. Anyway, I then cut out the rough shape that I'd outlined before and then actually use that as an outline for the next layer, so I know to stay about an inch or two within that shape. Repeating that process over and over again, eventually I was left with a very rough mountain shape that resembles something of an elevation map. Next comes the hot glue, and you can use something like PVA glue if you'd rather, as you may end up with an imperfect bond between layers if you use hot glue like I'm doing here. You can even see some of the gaps on the edges as I go along. However, I know that this will be covered up later, and honestly, I'm in a bit of a hurry to get things done for tomorrow night's session. And on that note, it's now time to start roughing up the edges of our island. I'm using this clay sculpting tool because I was trying to move really fast without cutting myself, but you can always just use a knife if you'd rather. In the past, I've been a bit more intentional with this step, but here I'm just taking out big chunks all the way around and blending between the gaps of each layer of foam. As you can see, you will be making quite a mess. Just keep a broom and dustpan handy for afterwards. And finally, we're left with something like this. If it looks a bit too jagged and rocky at this point, don't worry, we're going to tone that down a bit later. Oh, and I also made some smaller floating rocks that'll go around the side of the island. Next, for the first time, I'm using some Sculptamold for this build. I've used regular joint compound for projects in the past, but after using this stuff, I'm never going back. The fibrous texture that it leaves behind and the overall sculptiness really just sets this stuff apart and makes the whole process pretty effortless. However, I did end up mixing too much in my first batch and had to waste a lot of product. It hardened up a lot faster than I thought it would. But with another couple applications of Sculptamold and some last-minute shaping with a little leftover water, we're ready to move on. For the beam of light that holds up our whole island, I used this clear plastic tubing from the hardware store. It took me a little while to find it, but it was in the plumbing section, and when I asked the nearby worker what it's typically used for, he just told me that 9 out of 10 times, people just buy it for crafts like this. Neat. Now, I won't lie to you, this next step made me a little nervous as I sort of just eyeballed where I was going to drill to place our tubing. I used a hole saw attachment for my drill to do this, but you can just as easily cut it out with a knife. After nearly destroying my entire creation by having the drill set at too high of a speed, I got to sanding the outside of the clear tube from earlier. If you're wondering why this was necessary, here's an example of the light shining through the clear side and the sanded side. As you can see, the sanded side does a much better job of catching the light, making the beam as bright as possible. Then, after a quick dry fit proved that the hole in our island was just a bit too large, I applied some more Sculptamold to the inside of that hole so that it would fit our beam more snugly. While that cured, I glued our little RGB puck light into the tubing, being careful to make sure that the batteries could still be changed later if needed. Then glued the other side of that tube to a small cut of plexiglass that I'd also picked up from the hardware store. I used hot glue for both, but you may want to use something a bit sturdier if you have the time. Honestly, building a small second structure at the bottom to house a second light wouldn't be a bad idea at all. Now it's starting to look like something, so after I let things cure overnight, it was time for some paint the following morning. As usual, I started with a dark gray base coat using my airbrush, but just brushing it on will work fine as well. I just like to use the airbrush for my base coat since it tends to make quick work of things. Once it was all completely covered, I took a moment to give the rock a quick zenithal highlight since the light would be coming from the beam at the bottom. I then followed that up with some random patches of reddish brown, yellow, and olive green so the rock had a bit more color variation. I know it looks weird now, but trust me, that'll look a lot more natural in the finished work. After that, I brushed on some of the same olive green from before all over the top, in case any of the flocking we do later has any gaps in it. And while that dries, I give the rest of my island some dry brushing in a brown, light brown, and then a very light dry brushing of a pale gray to areas I felt would catch more light from the beam below. The idea is that whatever color the beam is will be reflected by the pale gray and fit the overall color scheme of whatever I'm going for. Finally, it's time for a little PVA glue and flocking. I'm using a fine earth blend from Woodland Scenics, but in the past I've used coffee grounds. In this case, however, I didn't have the grounds on hand and I didn't feel like wasting a bunch of coffee for it. After that, I gave it a light dusting of some more green flocking and soaked it all down in some scenic cement. Once I'd given the same treatment to the smaller islands, I decided to install some hanging roots in the bottom of the island, as if it had just been pulled up from the ground. I found these golden brown twigs at the local hobby store and thought they would be perfect for this, but you can also use any odd branch from outside. By twisting in a small drill bit by hand, I was able to make a hole small enough to fit each twig, and I added a bit of super glue to hold it in place. Then it was time to move on to the other floating rocks around the island. I was a bit stumped on this part at first, but ultimately found some thick brown floral wire at the hobby store. This worked out perfect since it looked like it could pass for vines and was actually rigid enough to hold the smaller rocks in place. I did end up adding more than one vine to the larger rocks, but in the end it was plenty sturdy enough to hold the occasional mini or terrain element. And as an added bonus, they could be moved around after since the floral wire remained flexible. But you may have noticed one other part of this build. That's right, I needed something to go on top of this amazing island, so I printed out a massive portal from Loot Studios. It came out in about 18 separate pieces, but it was easy enough to print out, remove supports, and get painted up just in time for the session. But with all that, the build is finished, so let's have a look at how it all laid out on the game table. My players were absolutely blown away whenever I dropped this on the table mid-session, and I can't wait to use it again someday. After all, it could be anything from a skybound portal to another world, to a mad wizard's tower at the edge of reality. All that's really needed is to change the color of the beam, throw on some different terrain, reposition the floating rocks, and add a little theater to make anything possible. So if you'd like to see more awesome creations like this in the future, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, as always, go out there and make some chaos.